and welcome back to the Angry Scotland podcast. This is a bit of an improvised episode, as some anti-EU propaganda has been shoved through my letterbox, and I want to talk about it. So you can tell looking at this that it's clearly a pro-Brexit leaflet that has been produced by the Europe of Freedom and Direct Democracy group. Now, from what I understand about the EFDD, they are made up of three small political entities. One is the Brexit Party itself. The other two, I will confess, I do not even recall the names of at the moment, but one is based in Italy, the other is based in Croatia. And what's rather amusing about these three groups is that out with their shared hatred of the EU, they have nothing in common. The Brexit Party is obviously fairly right-wing, to say the least. The other two, I believe, one is a combination of left and right policies, and the other is a very left-wing group. So effectively, when they're in the European Parliament, they very rarely vote unanimously together on any issues whatsoever. So effectively, they're just some noisy bastards on the side that just want to turn up and talk about how much they think the EU sucks. So in everyday life, they are basically that person that turns up in your boardroom meeting and just constantly complains for half an hour but never actually offers any viable suggestions or alternatives. So that's who's made it. And the bottom line on the EFDD, in my book, is that they have just banded together for the sake of getting some cash in the door and some minor influence over EU law. That's all it is. They have no real constructive purpose out with that. So to get into the actual leaflet itself then, the first thing that jumped out at me was this picture of a train that they've put on the front of it. It's important to note that at no other point in the leaflet are trains shown or mentioned. I don't really know why it's there. I guess they just thought, hey, people like trains. Also noticed it was a steam train, which is a fairly archaic and redundant form of transport, which is probably quite fitting, really, for a pro-Brexit leaflet. But getting into the wordage then, it says more than 1 million Scots voted to leave the EU in the successful 2016 referendum, though since then the overbearing voices of the Remain side have shouted down concerns about why they chose Brexit in the first place. So, first of all, Scotland overwhelmingly voted Remain in 2016. Secondly, when you bring up overbearing voices, as this leaflet does, you want to know what I find overbearing? People shoving shit like this through my letterbox. So you're in a situation where Scotland voted Remain, it made its decision, and now it's the overbearing Leave side shoving shit through my fucking front door that is the overbearing part of the equation. It then goes on to talk about how independent polling commissioned by the European of Freedom and Direct Democracy group in the European Parliament has found those concerns remain valid today and deserve to be listened to and acted upon by our political representatives. So point one on that is the alleged independent polling was conducted by David Coburn MEP of UKIP. So effectively you've got a pro-Brexit, anti-EU group commissioning a pro-Brexit, anti-EU man to conduct the polling of only 3,000 people. UKIP's David Coburn has waddled around Scotland asking people their opinion, and this is now being presented as some sort of formalised independent polling, when in fact it really is just one bloke doing it. A second thing is this point about people's concerns deserve to be listened to and acted upon by our political representatives. That's a fair comment, but the thing about that is the people who largely hold this view that is in this leaflet, these pro-Brexit, anti-EU points of view, they don't get out and vote in large numbers. The bottom line with this is that if you look at the Scottish Parliament, it's overwhelmingly a Remain Parliament. There is no real representation there of people that are pro-Brexit, and the reason why that is because no fucker votes for them. So if you want to respect democracy, then you have to respect this is the parliament that was elected by the people of Scotland. If these people feel so passionately about their far right-wing pro-Brexit approach, they can get out and vote. They can change that situation. But the bottom line is that hasn't happened. And they keep banging on about respecting democracy so much, where they could perhaps start with their own country. They are producing a leaflet that is specifically targeting Scotland. This is not produced mass for the United Kingdom. It is targeting Scotland specifically, and yet does not seem to show any respect towards how Scotland voted in the 2016 referendum, which is rather ironic because they only ever bang on about respecting the vote that England made in the 2016 referendum. So the leaflet then goes on to talk about how our poll found that the Scottish public remains uncomfortable with the level of interference that the European Union has in Scotland and does not want it to have any more control over Scottish laws than it already has. So that's wonderful. 3,000 people, a drop in the fucking ocean, versus the entire population of Scotland have those concerns. If they have those concerns, they can get out and vote and elect people to represent them and their opinions in the Scottish Parliament. But until they do that, nothing's going to fucking change. Nearly 2/3 of those, the leaflet goes on to say, who were asked rejected the idea of Scotland ever adopting the euro as its national currency. Okay, that's a fair position to hold. Even within the Scottish independence movement, the majority of people that support yes, from my understanding, would prefer Scotland to have its own currency. Very few people within the SNP and the Scottish independence movement seem to be advocating for joining the euro, and it is perfectly possible for Scotland to be an independent country, and for the United Kingdom, for that matter, to exist and be in the European Union and not have the euro. It's perfectly possible to be an independent nation within the European Union and not use the euro. So I don't even understand what that argument is about. Finally, it says, a clear majority in the poll agreed that regardless of the Brexit outcome, Scotland's best prospects for economic growth are to remain a part of the United Kingdom. Now, whether or not that turns out to be the case, I don't know, and I don't really want to weigh in on the economics of an independent Scotland at this time. I believe that the economics of an independent Scotland will be dictated purely by the circumstances and timing of Scottish independence occurring. It is a bridge that we will cross as and when we get to it. My issue with that statement is that the people that are suggesting this, your David Coburns, your Nigel Farage, your far-right crash out without a deal in October Brexiteers, are on record really as having the opinion that they are okay with economic damage. They are okay with the United Kingdom's economy being greatly damaged by Brexit. We know what the outcome is going to be with Brexit, and it's not going to be sunshine and rainbows. We're not going to see an era of great growth on the back of this Brexit project. And these Brexiteers are now saying that it's not about the money, it's not about economic growth, it's about the principle of the thing. But to suggest that Scotland's economic growth will be better in the UK and make that your selling point for the Union, to me seems very hypocritical and daft when you consider that economic growth of the United Kingdom within the EU is so readily discounted by these people. I thought about cutting this short and just talking about the front cover, but fuck it, we're on a roll here, so why not open it up and see what's inside? So upon opening the leaflet, then we are greeted with the incredibly cringeworthy slogan of "Be a Brexit believer!" And then it says, "We're standing up for Scotland and direct democracy." Which is interesting, because direct democracy, as I understand it, isn't really what Scotland's relationship is like with Westminster, within the UK. You know, if you talk about direct democracy in the sense that you break power down to the smallest level possible, you know, so things like policy and law, control over such things and such matters is put down to the smallest number of people in the smallest area possible. Okay, I might not agree with it, but I can at least understand where you're coming from. But the way they're trying to suggest that, EU bad, UK good, without much in the way of consistent logic, I find to be odd. Now, I know the comeback to that is, well, Scotland wants to vote to leave the UK but wants to stay in the EU. How does that work? Well, every country in the European Union is an independent country. It's perfectly possible for Scotland to want to leave the UK, which is very much going in this Brexity direction, as in a total rejection of globalisation. It's perfectly possible for Scotland to want its independence, but also to be part of globalism, to be part of an international community. I think there is consistent logic in this idea of being an independent nation voluntarily wanting to be part of a larger group of nations. What I find difficult to understand is how people that are both for Brexit and for keeping the UK together, I find it hard to understand where they're coming from with that. Because if they're arguing that centralisation is bad, well, that has to apply to the UK surely as well. Whereas the Scottish independence argument is not, at least from the SNP's end, really about centralisation being bad. It's about Westminster being bad. The SNP, even how they've conducted themselves in government, would give everyone quite a clear indication that they're very much in favour of centralisation. And a lot of countries already in the EU are independent and have that mentality as well. So I don't think it's the Scottish independence side with the problem with logical consistency. I definitely believe that it's the Brexit side, or the Brexit unionist side, I should say. Now, the other interesting thing about what's on the inside of this is that it also says here, please place this poster where everyone can see it. I've never ever seen that on a campaign leaflet before, where the leaflet actively has to tell the person to please put this in your window. Now, I don't know if that just means that the target audience for this Brexit leaflet aren't clever enough to figure out how to do that themselves and have to be actively told or begged, perhaps, to put this propaganda piece in the window where everyone can see it. So, flipping on to the back then, there's a whole section here on fishing. Now, I'll be the first to admit, I don't know an awful lot about the European Union's Common Fisheries Policy. I don't know an awful lot about this issue. I live in Glasgow. I'm centre of the country, essentially. So, if you're out on the coast, all power and respect to you. If this is a major issue for you, I respect it and I get it. For me, it's not. And that's just one of those things. In the same way that, the pollution levels in Glasgow city centre might not be of much interest to someone living in Oban, for example. So it's not disrespectful, it's just to admit up front that I don't know an awful lot about this. But I do have some issues with how the stats are presented and how the information is presented. So it says here, here's what Scotland thinks. Telling us what we think. Again, remember that part early on about overbearing? Here's what Scotland thinks. No, here's what 3,000 people that happen to live in Scotland think. Not what the whole country thinks. So the first stat is 89% agree that fishing is vital to Scotland. Well, that's a fair one. I think if you asked any random 3,000 people in Scotland, or any Scottish person, or anyone living in Scotland, or even visiting Scotland, they would probably say, yes, we do think that fishing is vital to Scotland. Even if you were just visiting Scotland, you could probably come up with that answer. It's the next two stats I've got more of an issue with. The first one says 49% agree the EU harms our fishing industry. Okay, so that's less than half of the 3,000 people asked, 49%. So you're not even kind of on a winning level on your own leaflet there. The other stat, more significantly, says 45% agree the EU wants more control of fishing waters. So 45% was always held up as the losing figure in the 2014 Scottish independence referendum. So the Unionists, the likes of David Coburn, who did the polling for this, for example, would argue that 45% makes you a loser. A loser. A loser. However, here, that figure is presented in a positive light. There are then some paragraphs that elaborate on these statistics. So it says here, one issue in Scotland that raises intensely strong feelings among the public is the European Union's continuing involvement in the fishing industry. Well, as a member of the Scottish public, and I'm sure many of you listening are too, my response to that is, if you know about fishing, if you have strong knowledge about the European Union's common fisheries policies, you may have intensely strong feelings about this issue. But I'll say for most of us that don't know an awful lot about fishing and don't know an awful lot about the common fisheries policy, it doesn't really raise intensely strong feelings. So to say that that's universal across Scotland, I think is incredibly misleading. The next paragraph says, our poll found that the vast majority of people asked, 89%, agree that fishing remains a vital part of Scotland's coastal economy and heritage. So, as previously mentioned, I think that's a fair comment in the beginning part of that paragraph, about 89% agreeing that fishing is vital to Scotland. I've got no dispute there. My issue with this paragraph is the use of the economy, and I come back to my previous point that the economy is something that is seen as complete collateral damage in the mind of the Brexiteer. We know Brexit is going to be economically disastrous, and now these Brexiteers are selling Brexit as a matter of principle. It's not going to be sunshine and roses, and that is a price worth paying for our freedom. That's how they are approaching it. They're incredibly selective about when they raise the economy and when they don't in terms of Brexit. So the leaflet continues, we also found that most people, 49%, agree as opposed to 10% who disagree. So I'm not quite sure how that works. It says, we also found that most people, 49%, most of you agree that 49% is not most, agree as opposed to 10% who disagree, that the European Union's common fisheries policy has been bad for the Scottish fishing industry. So what that's telling me is that a lot of people who were asked this question responded in much the way I did at the beginning of this discussion by saying, I don't know an awful lot about fishing. I don't understand the issue. I don't know. And it's very hard for you to form a strong opinion on something you don't know much about. So potentially a well-conducted polling would have been to inform the public on the matter, on the issue, so they did know what the subject matter at hand was really all about. They understood the ins and outs of it. Whereas clearly they've just been put on the spot and blurted out the first thing that's come to mind. So it says, we also found that most people, brackets 49% agree as opposed to 10% who disagree, brackets close, believe that the European Union's common fisheries policy has been bad for the Scottish fishing industry. What's important to note there is that at no point does it explain why or how it's been bad for the Scottish fishing industry. So this is an opinion piece in the most literal sense. It's essentially just people expressing an opinion. It's not informing the reader. So I'm reading that going, well, why has it been bad? How has it been bad? Can you cite any examples of why that is the case? And the leaflet simply does not. So we are simply to believe that David Coburn is now an expert on fishing industry matters, and the 3,000 people they asked are also coincidentally expert on fishing matters, because this leaflet provides us with no information on the subject. To clarify, this isn't me saying that the EU common fisheries policy is great, or that it's shit. I'm simply saying that I don't know, and this leaflet does nothing to inform me about it. What I will say, though, is that if there is an issue with fishing and the European Union, I would suggest it's something that would be best fixed from within the EU. It would seem very daft to me that for the sake of improving one area of the economy, fishing, we would nuke the rest of the economy, which seems to be the scenario that we're being talked into by the Brexiteers here. It seems like a very overblown reaction. It's like finding out that you've got cancer in your foot, and therefore the way to solve that problem is to blow up the rest of your body. It doesn't really make an awful lot of sense. It then continues, and not only do Scottish people believe the EU has harmed the fishing industry in the past, they also believe that it wants even more control of Scotland's fishing waters in the future, with 45% of people agreeing and just 13% disagreeing. So once again, we're seeing a significant chunk of the people asked about this have just not weighed in, and 45% again is not most people. And in that paragraph, much like the previous one, we don't really elaborate on what they mean by a lot of this. So it says, and not only do Scottish people believe the EU has harmed the fishing industry in the past, again with no example as to why or how that is the case, they go on to say they also believe that it wants even more control of Scotland's fishing waters in the future. Again, with no explanation about what control means, because most of us that live in the real sane world know that control can be good, it can be bad. There is good management and there is bad management. So the fact that they want more control does not necessarily mean negative. This is presented in a negative light, but with no explanation as to what that control will entail. It would be very difficult for someone like myself that's ignorant of the issue of fishing, the issue of the EU's involvement with Scottish fishing, to come to any sort of view or opinion about if that control could be good or bad. If you could elaborate on what you mean by control, then I could have an informed, reasoned opinion. But that's not what these Brexit bastards want. They don't want you to be informed. They don't want you to understand the facts. They just want to throw some opinion shit in your face. So it's opinion with no information, which is the worst kind of opinion. So we're approaching the end now, but it continues. It became clear amongst those who were questioned that Scotland will not surrender control of its waters to the European Union without a fight. Which is just bizarre to me, because that kind of implies that there's some sort of ongoing war right now. You know, I mean, are there actual battleships off the coast of Scotland engaged in a war over fish? I believe firmly that this is something that can be negotiated with the European Union. I don't believe that the European Union are approaching this as a conflict situation. They are not asking us to surrender control of our waters to them. This is something that is voted upon democratically. There is room for negotiation. The thing is, if you're going into negotiations using war-esque terms like surrender and so forth, if you're viewing it as a fight, you know, it says here, will not surrender control of waters without a fight. If you're going in with that kind of conflict-based language, you're not going to successfully negotiate anything. You converse, you do not confront. I mean, that is simple life lesson stuff. It's basic business. And the fact that these people all claim to be great businessmen and economic geniuses, and yet fail to understand even the basic forms of negotiation and discussion is kind of mind-blowing. So in the second last paragraph then it says, of those asked, a net majority of 55% said no to giving more control of Scottish fishing waters to the EU. Again, there's no definition of what that control means. So if you put that question to the public and you emphasise control as being negative, it's very likely that they'll reply, well, no, I don't want that. Whereas if I was to say, if the EU had more of a managerial say on Scottish fishing with the intentions of improving it for all involved, would you support that? Suddenly that becomes a whole different question. But effectively, I'm saying essentially the same thing. It's giving them more control over a situation. Finally, the leaflet ends with, the strong and clear message sent to the EU was, stay out of our industry, stay out of our waters, and stop interfering. And again, when you're dealing with people that are advocating that kind of message, there is no room for negotiation. There's no room for improvement. That is not constructive criticism. That is not seeking compromise. That is not looking for the best result for all involved. That is just fuck you and go away. And I believe that there is scope for negotiation on this matter. I would be stunned if there would not be. But I can fully understand why the EU would have no interest on negotiating this issue with a total arsehole like Nigel Farage. I don't believe that man could successfully negotiate with anybody apart from a middle-aged white guy with a pint. I don't believe it's within his ability to actually communicate and create constructive compromises and to create a better world for the majority. I think that his mindset is to target an improvement for his minority audience and people that ultimately only benefit him. It's not within his mind to see the big picture and what the greater good is of anything. So it's just a bit depressing getting to the end of this leaflet and just despairing of the fact that there will be people out there that will buy into this crap, that will not quite simply read that and come to the fairly basic conclusions that I've drawn from it. And I'll be the first to admit, I am not a super intelligent man. I'm fairly fucking stupid. And the fact that even I can look at that and go, well, that's clearly horseshit. Or at the very least, that wasn't terribly informative. It's impossible, I think, at this point to negotiate with individuals that are buying into this crap. Because this is not fact-driven. This is opinion-driven. It's conclusion-biased. It is, the EU is bad, therefore. And I'll find anything, even if it's fleeting opinion polls like this, that are biased to begin with because they were conducted by an anti-EU individual. Even if I can cling and clutch to these ultimately pretty meaningless statistics, I will take that because it backs up my conclusion bias of the EU is bad. And that's all they're looking for. They're wanting to discount the overwhelming amount of information out there to say that the EU is at least the best option that we presently have. Now, if someone can come up with a better idea, I'm willing to listen. But in life, you do not blow up the entire situation. You don't just burn a bridge, destroy your circumstances just for the sake of doing it. You find viable alternatives. You go, well, you know what, that's not so great, but what about this? And as long as you say, but what about this, and offer a positive alternative, I'm all ears for that. We are now living in a globalized world where cooperation between nations is increasingly more and more important. With the existence of the internet now, and so much business being done online digitally on an international level, having humans broadly working together and coming to more of a consensus on common morality is extremely important. And what is not going to work moving into the rest of the 21st century and beyond is to simply all pile into our own little areas, put up the walls and hope no one comes a-knocking. That isn't going to fly. And that seems to be the alternative that these Brexiteers are putting forth. And it cannot be done. You cannot unstir a cup of coffee. We cannot go backwards. We've invented the airplane now. We are in a globalized society. The internet is here. We are all communicating with people all over the planet. You cannot go back. The world that these people are trying to go back to cannot be reached, and it was never that great to begin with. So this stuff that is being obnoxiously shoved through my fucking door can suck my balls. It's terrible. It is the worst kind of poison that you can put into the waters of humanity, and it should be stomped the fuck out. And Nigel Farage can get to fuck. And when he gets to fuck, he can fuck off some more.